We now move on to the subject of education, and particularly school choice and the, I think, under-the-radar revolution that's taking place in education around the world at the moment. We've got, again, a very distinguished panel for you here, and without further ado, I'll hand over to the first of our speakers, Polly Dixon.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And this is my third appearance at Think, so I'm deeply honoured to be on the same platform as Corey D'Angelo, Steve Humble, and Toby Young. So fantastic. What I did do, though, in the break, apart from signing our book, and you should all have one of our books in your packs, apart from signing those, we came up with some slides, because if you haven't seen our talks before and you haven't thought about school choice, and Professor Helen Berry gave some great questions for you to think about around historical context, but I thought you'd like to see some of the schools that we work in around the world, and that is featured, or are featured in some of the chapters in school choice around the world. I have been so fortunate. 20 years of my life I have spent in slum areas and informal settlements, meeting children, meeting teachers and parents, and trying to find out what's happening. How many schools are there? How do parents choose the schools for their children if they're very, very poor? And these are some of the countries that I've worked in, as well as Dr. Steve Humble. So you can see here Sub-Saharan Africa, India and China. You might think, parents choosing schools, surely they all access government schools. Well, actually, they don't. And there are many reasons why they don't. These are some of the children that I come across carrying their little water buckets and bottles and so on. These are the beautiful children who have got school choice in Kenya, and this is in Kibera. Some of the wonderful children whose mums and dads are paying for them to go to low-cost private schools. Here we have some children in Nigeria. This is in Makoko. They're learning to speak English. They're learning maths. They're following a curriculum. They're going to make something of their lives. They want to be part of society. Their mums want them to make a difference. Here's some schools down some alleyways. We've walked around alleyways, around every street corner, finding out how many schools there are, because nobody knew that low-cost private schools, unrecognised ones, existed. They thought children were out of school. Well, actually, you're wrong. What really annoyed me once, I read a World Bank report, and it said, poor parents are going to have to be patient. We're going to have to be patient because we need to fix state education. Duh. Parents aren't patient. They want the best for their children now, just like we do. They want the best for their children. They're not going to wait for the World Bank. So they start their own schools. Community schools, for-profit schools, not-for-profit schools, NGO schools, faith-based mission schools. And you can read all about this in our wonderful book. And this is Steve Humble's fault, because he suggested we write this. And I got together some of my favourite authors and some of my favourite people. And I'm so lucky for them to be on the stage. This is me in my younger days, longer hair, thinner body, probably same jacket, actually. But with some of the teachers there, and these are some teachers from low-cost private schools in Nigeria. Here's a little boy. Actually, he's in an orphanage. He's in an orphanage in India, and he's dying of HIV, a bit like the orphanages that Professor Berry was speaking about. Also in the book, we talk about low-cost private schools, but also other things like vouchers, and I know Corey D'Angelo is going to speak a little bit about vouchers. But we had a voucher program that we carried out for ARC, Absolute Return for Kids. And this is us going around telling people, would you like a voucher for school? So obviously, lots of people were signing up. And this is looking at people applying for the vouchers. And this is what the vouchers look like. And they had a barcode on them. And then children could take them to schools and spend them in low-cost private schools if they couldn't afford them. Because there are thousands and thousands of low-cost private schools. 60% of children in some slum areas go to low-cost private schools, whether they're recognised or unrecognised. This is teaching phonics. So I've done lots of work in schools, teaching children how to read using phonics. And there's one of the teachers doing some fantastic jolly phonics there. And again, some children in a low-income school in Delhi doing phonics. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions. I'm looking forward to you answering the book. But my goodness, how fortunate I've been.
Richard, I think, please.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Yes, it was my idea to have a school choice book around the world. And really that idea came about because I just thought people should know. People should know that very poor people are actually choosing. So they're making informed choices. And this is what we've found wherever we've gone around the world, like Pauline says. In very poor areas, in informal settlements, very poor families are making choices. And they're not only making a choice about which type of school to go, they're making an informed choice. If you, when you have the chance, if you look in the book on page 123, you'll see that for the particular one we've got in here about Liberia, and there's detail about the level of household incomes and things like that. These parents are choosing, and they have certain criteria that they're choosing on. They're looking at whether the school's affordable for them. They're looking at the discipline in the school. They're looking to see whether the school's safe, whether it's close to their home, whether the school has a good reputation, so they ask family and friends and other students that go to different schools. They're looking at academic performance. They're looking to see whether the teacher marks the book, whether the teacher actually turns up to class. And they're also assessing the quality of teaching by actually visiting these schools. And this is in Liberia, that in 2003 just came out of civil war. The country is in disarray. They've been in civil war for 10 years and they came out then. They're still now, as you'll read in the book, trying to put together their educational system. But like Pauline said, the parents aren't waiting for that. They're going to community schools, they're going to religious schools, they're going to private schools. So they're going to a whole range. They're choosing, as well as picking the government option. So I think it's an important thing to realize that poor parents can choose. Thank you.
If you didn't know, I'm Corey DeAngelis. I'm from Washington, D.C., so I bring a little bit of a U.S. flavor to the discussion of school choice today. So before Pauline mentioned voucher programs, by show of hands, how many people have heard of voucher programs or are familiar with what they do? So about 20% of the room, maybe? Maybe that's an underestimate because most people think they're going to be called on if they raise their hands. But essentially in the US, I think it's a little different from in London in that there's a ton of monopoly power in the education system, particularly for K through 12 in the United States because of two things. One, funding through property taxes. If you don't like the school, you still have to pay for it through property taxes. But then more importantly, I think, is residential assignment. In the US, you essentially are assigned to schools based on where you live. So just imagine if you were residentially assigned to one restaurant and you wanted to pick another restaurant and you had to move houses to be able to change your choice of restaurant from week to week. That would be highly costly to do. And so what that does is it puts a lot of power into the hands of the producers of education in the United States. So I think that's one of the largest problems that we have in the US as far as our K-12 education system is concerned. Voucher programs allow students to break up that residential assignment in a sense, where they can take a fraction of their education dollars that are assigned to the student and take some of that money to pay for a private school tuition or fees. We also have other types of school choice in the US. You've heard of charter schools. They are free schools that cannot charge tuition, have to accept all students at random. 45 out of 50 states have charter schools in the US. Over half of the states in the US have some type of private school choice program. We also have this new phenomena called education savings accounts. It's like a voucher where you can take some of that money to pay for a private school, but the money goes into a savings account, kind of like a health savings account. And you can use that to pay for private school tuition and fees. You can pay for nice books like these. You can pay for online courses. You can pay for any type of educational service that's approved by the government. So it really education savings accounts are moving the conversation from school choice to education choice, at least in the US, because schooling is just one way to get an education, and it's arguably not a very great way to get an education, some might argue. My work has mostly been looking at the non-academic outcomes of these types of programs in the United States. So I think as economists, we focused way too much on standardized test scores for a long time now, and I think it's just because that's the most readily available data that we've had. I don't know if you've heard the joke with the economist under the light post, and I won't go over it today, I don't have enough time, but essentially economists just like to look at things that are readily available, especially ones that like econometric techniques. But I've looked at outcomes such as whether these programs affect criminal activity, civic participation, volunteerism, charitable activity, tolerance of others. So if you look at chapter 4, I review some of that evidence looking at the civic outcomes of these types of programs. And the evidence tends to be more in favor of school choice once you start getting away from the test score outcomes. And I think it's because parents aren't really, I think aren't really all that excited about standardized test scores. So they pick schools based on their religious identity, based on the culture at the school, based on peer groups, and based on a lot of other factors that aren't easily captured in the standardized test score. And so we should expect the evidence to be more in favor when we're looking at things that parents are actually choosing based on. Just to go over one of the studies, the crime study that I most recently did was of the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. It's the longest standing modern day voucher program in the United States. It's been around for around 3 decades now, and we followed students until they were about 28 years of age. And we found that students exposed to the voucher program relative to their traditional public school peers saw an 86% reduction in property damage crimes, a 53% reduction in drug-related crimes, and even a 38% reduction in paternity suits. So I think this is because of the culture of the schools, that they're not just focusing on test scores, they're focusing on the entire student. So I'd be happy to answer any questions afterwards about the methods of these studies or just the body of evidence in general. Thank you.
Hi, I feel like the heretic on this panel at a recent policy exchange event on education, which Joanna organized. I was critical of choice and innovation, and said that we didn't need to focus as much anymore on expanding choice and innovation in England, in the English taxpayer-funded school sector, because choice and innovation aren't, I don't think, ends in themselves, but are a means to an end. I mean, this is a tension within conservative thought between social libertarians and social conservatives. And I kind of veer towards the libertarian end, so I should be more sympathetic to choice and innovation as ends in themselves. But I also think that part of the rationale for the academies and the free schools program was to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, not just because we liked gazing at lots of different types of flowers and we wanted to maximize choices for parents, but also as a form of experimentation to see which of those flowers grew the tallest, which were the most robust. And I think now that we've had about 15 years, a bit longer, of academies and free schools, we're beginning to get a clear picture of what works best. And it's the same picture that's emerged in the US in the charter school sector. One of the great things about the random admissions policies operated by charter schools is it creates a natural randomized control trial in which you can compare the attainment of the kids who are lotteried in to the attainment of the kids who are identical in almost every other respect, but just didn't win a place in the lottery. And by doing a series of those lottery-based studies, a number of gold standard researchers from some of the most prestigious universities in the US have identified the most successful type of charter school, which is the no excuses urban charter school. Charter schools modeled on the Knowledge is Power program that originally started in Harlem. There's an emphasis on longer than average school days, getting all the kids college ready, zero tolerance for poor behavior, but also zero tolerance for failure, no excuses for failure. and they have generally younger than average staff. They have uniform policies and so forth. They're pretty traditional. They're not progressive. They're pretty traditional. And then they've been the most successful, particularly when it comes to closing the attainment gap between kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers. They're the only schools that consistently manage to reduce that attainment gap between minorities from disadvantaged neighborhoods and more affluent white children, reduce that attainment gap to zero. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. And the most successful academy chains in England, ARC, Harris, ULT, Inspiration Trust, they're all, broadly speaking, they're like English versions of this American no excuses urban charter school. In the case of the Michaela Community School, started by Catherine Berbelsing, which posts its first GCSE results this year, and which I expect to be very good, it actually has "Knowledge is Power" written on the outside of the building, so clearly inspired by the Knowledge is Power schools in Harlem. And most of the successful free schools are also, broadly speaking, modeled on these successful American schools. So I wasn't saying that parents in the free schools program, charity groups, shouldn't be able to start other types of schools, shouldn't be able to continue to experiment up to a point. But I think there should now be a default model. And the default model is the English version of the no excuses urban charter school. And in particular, there are a bunch of failing schools known by the acronym of SNOWs, schools that no one wants. And they tend to be in very, very disadvantaged areas, serving predominantly white working class children, often in coastal areas. They can't be taken over by multi-academy trusts. They're often losing money. They're basket cases for the most part. I think that if you could empower some of the most successful multi-academy trusts with a bit of money to move in and take over these schools and impose what they know works, in particular in those areas, you could transform the attainment of our most disadvantaged communities. So I think, choice and innovation, all very well, and obviously great in the developing world, transforming educational opportunities in the developing world. But in England, I think we also need to look at what we now know works as a result of choice and innovation having been in place for the last 15 years.
Okay.